with Joe Hess, a Holocaust survivor from Germany. We were originally scheduled to have Ruth Berndorf speak today, but we had to reschedule, so Ruth will speak very soon. Holocaust Museum Los Angeles is the first Holocaust survivor-founded Holocaust museum in the United States. In the 1960s, a group of survivors worked together to create a memorial for their loved ones who perished in the Holocaust. And this memorial eventually became Holocaust Museum Los Angeles. These survivors who established our museum did so with a mission to commemorate, educate, and inspire future generations. Furthermore, they mandated that our museum should always be free to the public, making a Holocaust education accessible to everyone. Even though we are not able to be in our museum's physical space for the time being, we are still able to carry forward their mission. This morning, you have the honor and privilege of listening to Joe Hess, who will share his story with you. After Joe shares his story, you can type in your questions in the Q&A box, or those watching on Facebook in the comments, and he will answer as many as possible. Before the pandemic, Joe spoke at our museum a couple of times, and we are so honored to have him join us this late morning, early afternoon, as he shares his very important story with our community. We are so grateful to have you right now, and thank you so much for speaking and for participating in our program this morning. And I will hand it over to you now. Welcome, Joe, on behalf of everyone. Okay. And you can start sharing anytime.
Okay. Oh, thank you. And it's a pleasure being here and being able to tell my story, because I think it's extremely important that people remember. It's been many, many years and people forget over the years. And the Holocaust Museum does this to make sure that nobody forgets. So I was born in a little town called Fulda, Germany in 1932. Fulda is about 35 miles from Frankfurt. And I will tell you my story, but first let me give you a little bit of background, because I'm talking about the Kindred Transport, which is what's called the Children Transport. Was actually 10,000 children that were allowed to leave Germany and get into England. And I'll give you a little bit of a background. On November the 9th and 10th in 1938, the Nazis unleashed a wave of violent anti-Jewish acts, destroying Jewish businesses and burning over 1,000 synagogues. In fact, I watched our synagogue in Fulda burning from my grandmother's house. Hundreds of thousands of German Jews looked to the United States to immigrate. The immigration laws at that time only allowed 27,370 visas from Germany. So you can understand what the problem was. Over 300,000 Germans remained on the waiting list. My family was one of them. On February the 9th, 1939, Senator Wagner and Congresswoman Rogers introduced simultaneous bills to allow 10,000 children under the age of 17 each year in 1939 and 1940 to immigrate to the United States. The bills died in committee as a result of anti-immigration sentiment. In Britain, the House of Commons passed a bill to allow 10,000 children under 17 to enter the country, with the stipulation that those accepted the children had to provide £50, which was a lot of money at that time, as a bond to avoid any impact on the government. It was assumed that the children would be returned to their parents. Now, my sister and I, my sister is 6 years older than I, we were two of the lucky ones. In March 1939, my parents put us on a train that started our journey to Britain. Now, I was only 6 years old, so I remember with a little suitcase being put on the train. My sister didn't want to go. She wanted to commit suicide. She said, I don't want to leave mother and father. but they insisted that she go to take care of me and make sure that I was protected. It was very traumatic, but even at 6 years old with everyone crying, I really didn't know what was going on too much. We landed in England and my English family picked us up. He was a taxi cab driver, had 3 children of his own, and still was able to say that he would pick 2 children up, and we ended up living with them. Well, let's go to September 1st. September 1st, we lived in London, and in September 1st, the war broke out. And what happened was that they had a plan put forth that all the children would be evacuated out of London. So I was evacuated to a farm way out north, and my sister too, and also our siblings. My English parents decided this wasn't a good idea, and they ended up buying a house in a town called Letchworth, Hertfordshire, which is about 35 miles northeast of London. So we all moved into Letchworth. That's where I spent the war. Now, interesting, I didn't speak a word of English. My English parents didn't speak a word of German. I'm walking around looking at books and everything. We were able to communicate pretty much, but it took a long time. And with me going to school in England during the war, it was a little difficult because A, I was German, and 2, I was Jewish. So I was a dirty German Jew in school. So lots of fights, but we survived. Well, the story is the following, that Letchworth had 2, right near Letchworth, there were 2 American air bases, Bassingbourn and Stevenbourne. And of course, all the airmen, pilots, co-pilots, navigators, were all in their 20s. And of course, my sisters were eligible, so we had a lot of dating going on, and we had these Americans coming over to our house. And eventually, one fell in love with my foster sister, and they got engaged and decided to marry. The war goes on, and then the war finishes in 1945. So my future brother-in-law said, I'm going to go over to Europe, or they used to say over the pond, and I'm going to find out what happened to your parents, what happened to your family. Germans kept immaculate records. So unfortunately, he came back and said, got some bad news for you. Your mother, your father, grandmother, aunts and uncles, all gone. My English parents said not to worry, but at that time I was visiting a cousin who did survive from the Holocaust and was living in a yeshiva up in Liverpool. So he said, you know, now that you have no survivors, you're going to become a rabbi. I'm going to help you. My English mother got on a train, came up and took me by the ear and said, you're not going to be a rabbi. You're going to be a member of our family. That's how wonderful this family was that took us in. So now we go to after the war. Things weren't as good as England. My foster brother and I were reaching the age where we would have been going into the army. They did not want that to happen. My foster sister got married, and they sponsored us and the whole family in 1948 moved to Millville, New Jersey. So we took off on the Queen Mary and landed in New York, and then moved to New Jersey, where we opened up a chicken farm, like a lot of German Jews that immigrated did. And I went to high school there, graduated in 1950, and then went on to Rutgers University. The Korean War broke out, and I ended up having to go into the military, which wasn't too bad because I wasn't a citizen. They didn't know what to do with me. So they said, what would you like to do? And they gave me a list of things, and I said, meteorology looked interesting. So I ended up being what's called a weatherman. And I ended up being stationed in Boston, Massachusetts. And this is now in the 1952. And 1954, 55, I was able to get my citizenship. And in 1955, I came home from a date and I turned around to my roommate and I said, I got this strange call. My sister called and said my father's alive. Well, I was in shock. My boss at that time was Jewish. And when he heard the news the next morning, the whole office went crazy and they called down to Washington. The Air Force was very good, immediately put into motion that I would go to meet my father in Germany as soon as possible. And within 2 days, I was on a plane going to meet my father. The problem was I didn't speak German anymore. So they asked what they could do. So I said, could I get an interpreter? And they gave me a nurse interpreter that would go along with me. I landed in Frankfurt and one of the men from Life magazine said, if I can have the story, I'll drive you to Fulda. So I said, okay. We went to Fulda and lo and behold, I saw my father and my father saw me for the first time in 17 years. It was very, very traumatic. And I don't know if you could see the photo of me right now meeting with my father. Could you put that on, please? Michael? So here's a picture of me, actually the very, very first time seeing my father for 17 years. It turned out that he had, you can take that off. It turned out that he had been in 9 different concentration camps. He was very strong, but all in working capacity. You know how they made people work until they died, but he lasted. And when the war finished, the Russians came and accused him of working for the Germans, even though he was working for the Germans in the concentration camp. And they sentenced him to 10 years in Siberia. And therefore, in 1955, his 10 years were up and they said, you don't have any living relatives anymore. Why don't you stay in Russia? And he said, no, I think I'll go back. And he ended up going back to Fulda, called my aunt, my only living aunt in Ohio, and said, where is Ilsa and Seppel? Ilsa was my daughter and Seppel is what they called me. And they said they're alive and they're actually living in the United States. So that's how contact was made. And that's how we met wonderfully. And he said I'd like to stay in Germany. I said, you're crazy, because we were walking around and I swear people were looking at us as, how did they get away? Maybe that was my thoughts. So I made arrangements through the embassy to bring my father back the very next year. Got all the paperwork, brought him back to the United States. He ended up living in New York in a close Jewish community, remarried, wonderful lady. And then the years go by, and what happened was that he ended up enjoying all the things that he missed with me through my family. Because my wife and I, we got married in 1956, and under the chuppah was my father, my real father, my foster father, and it was fascinating to see that happen. But he ended up enjoying our lives because through our family, he enjoyed our children's bar mitzvahs, growing up, going to college, weddings. And he told me that he had prayed to God and God said that he was going to let him live to be 90. Well, it turned out he lived to be 91. So when I spoke at his funeral, I said he was such a good man that God gave him an extra year. So that's basically the story of my survival. I was very, very fortunate to have one, that the British were kind enough to allow 10,000 children in. When you think of the millions of children that were murdered and killed that could have been saved in the United States or in other countries, and then you only had 10,000 being legitimately saved in England, there are more stories, of course, like the Witten story, where he saved 1,000 children by himself. There were other people that were saving children, but the millions and millions that were lost shouldn't have been lost. But I really thank England, and I owe England a tremendous amount for my life. So why am I doing this? As I survived, I said to myself, why was I selected? We could have been killed too. Because I was selected, I became the ultimate volunteer. And after marriage, when we got married and everything else, I started volunteering everywhere, and especially in the Jewish community. Very active in the Jewish National Fund, been active in Jewish National Fund for over 30 to 40 years. I was national campaign chairman. And the only reason was, why was I doing that? Because if Israel had existed in 1935, 32, 33, 30, even 37, we would have an opportunity to move to Israel, and all those children would have been saved. So I thanked JNF for that, and I decided that I was going to make Israel even better by raising funds for JNF and making the lives of my fellow Jews in Israel better, and maybe more people could immigrate, as the Russians did when 600,000 of them came from Russia. So that's my volunteer role. And then as far as speaking is concerned, I speak to school children. I speak at the Holocaust Museum, wherever I can. It's not so much to tell my story. It's a little unique because of the fact of my father coming back the way it was. But the story has to be told. And I tell the children all the time when I speak to them, it starts at the home. You know, what is anti-Semitism? What is anti-Islam or anything? It starts in the home. Don't let that happen. When you hear a story, don't ignore it and just smile. Say it's not right. Don't bully. And I always leave a message with the children when I finish, and I say, how lucky you guys are. When you go home, please hug your parents. And that's how I usually end. So that's my story. It's a little different than what you've heard before, and I'm open to any questions.
Thank you so much for sharing that story with us. I know we have a couple of questions, and just as a reminder to audiences watching on Zoom, you can use the Q&A box. Those on Facebook, you can type in the comments. As you mentioned, the Kindred Transport, it's a very important story because it shows such an act of kindness in one of the darkest times in our history, and that's why we're so appreciative for you to share this story. You were about 6 years old when you last saw your mother. Is there anything specific that you remember about her?
At 6 years old, yes, of course. Strange things. We were, as most German Jews were, we were very religious. So Shabbat was very important to us. So Friday night, I always remember my mother making lakshin on the table, cutting the lakshin and making it on the table. I don't remember too much. I remember my grandmother and my mother, but not really. I remember more of my father because he was in the choir in the synagogue, and he used to carry me on my shoulders, on his shoulders, and we'd go to synagogue every Friday and Saturday, and he would sing, and I remember that. He was he was a cattle dealer in a way. He provided cattle to the farmers around here. We'd go to Holland and pick up cattle, etc., and horses. And we had a horse, and I remember I was so tiny I could go under the horse. So these are the little things that you remember, but not really much. I was too young.
And that leads me to the next question. So I know you were young, but do you know about your extended family, aunts, uncles? You mentioned a grandmother, and if so, do you know what happened to them? Did you ever find that out?
Yes, in fact, at the museum, we have records in the museum, the actual German records of where they got killed in which of the camps. Um, I had no other family until, here's another part of the story. And when my son was old enough, we sent him to Israel on one of these Jewish programs. He landed in Israel, and all of a sudden there was family there. And I asked my father, I said, "You mean I had family?" And he said, "Your mother's sister immigrated in 1927, married some, you have cousins in Israel." So we took off and went to Israel, and there are my cousins. But outside of my family in Columbus, Ohio, no other survived.
And by the time you were able to meet these cousins, were you able to meet your mother's sister?
She and her husband were still alive. And in 1970s, I took my father over, and one of the wonderful photos I have is he and his brother-in-law, hand in hand with tears in their eyes, meeting for the first time.
And did your father know your mother's sister, or did she immigrate before they got married?
But she immigrated before they got married, but obviously he knew the sister,
Right.
the sister-in-law, yeah.
And how many times have you been to Israel?
I lost count. When I was younger and very, very active, I was there at least once a year. So probably 30, 40 times. And I've seen Israel from the beginning, when we worked on water projects, and we worked on the Russians coming over, the Ethiopians coming over, and now to see Israel the way it is today is I'm just so happy that I made a little contribution there.
Thank you very much. Do you have photos of your mother and of your extended family?
Oh yes, I've got lots of photos, and my daughter compiled all these photos, because I have a wedding picture of my mother and father. I have pictures of my aunt and my grandmother, and we're making a memorial for them in a big plaque or something like that we put together. But yes, very lucky to get that.
Glad you have those. So you mentioned meeting your mother's sister when you were older. What was that experience like, having not remembering your mother that well, but then being able to meet her sister? Did you talk to her about your mother?
No, it wasn't so much her, it was her daughter that I became very close to. Her daughter married. So it was the daughter that was, and the daughter and the son were the real contacts, not so much their parents. Their parents then were living in an assisted living place. I mean, they were 80, 90 years old at that time. So I didn't have much contact with them outside of who I am and who they were, but I shared all the stories, and the stories were shared with me from their siblings. So I was close to their daughter and her family, and their son and his family, and still am today.
Glad to hear that. Did your father ever talk about his experiences in the concentration camps?
Interesting. The answer is no, for a long time. And I understand this is not unusual. This is something that is very common with survivors. But after he retired, I moved him to California. He moved to California. And I sat down with him and I said, "You need to write down all your memoirs," which he did. 270 pages. I have that. Now, unfortunately, it was written in German script, so I had to get someone from one of the universities to translate, and then I had it all translated and printed, and I have copies of it. I never published it. I've kept it in the family, but it's a horrific story of his experiences in the camps. I mean, it was absolutely horrific what he went through, and very descriptive of how the Nazis treated people in those camps.
You. How did your English family adjust to life in New Jersey?
Oh, it was different. Living on a chicken farm. Can you imagine somebody from England? He was a taxi cab driver, etc. And they decided the best way to make a living was a chicken farm. And we had something like 10,000 chickens. And, you know, it's a 7-day, 24/7 job. And it was quite an adjustment. And what happened was that the rule of immigration was that you couldn't take much money out of England at that time. This is 1948. We still were on rations in England. So what they did is they bought a lot of antique furniture and antiques. And that way brought that in. And then we opened up a little antique shop in Millville. So that was good. But I think they adjusted quite well. But their problem was, you see, was similar to us. Now they're in the United States and all their relatives are still in England. So they would travel back to England, for example, because of the medical rules there were entirely different. So if they wanted to get their teeth fixed or things like that, they travel back to England and get them done for nothing. So they did quite a bit of traveling back to visit their relatives there.
Thank you. These questions are related. How many children do you have? And have they been involved in the Jewish community? And then when did you tell your children about your experiences, and what was that experience like?
We have a son and a daughter. Daughter is 62, my son is 59. Wonderful kids. They have children of their own. I have 2 granddaughters and 2 grandsons and 1 great-grandson. So we're very blessed. They learned very early because of my involvement in the Jewish community, and especially in my temple. I was temple president in Long Beach, and I would tell the story, but I sat down with them very early to tell them about their background. I thought it very, very important that they understood who they were, where they came from, and the background. My daughter became very, very active in her synagogue in Los Angeles, in Valley Beth Shalom. And my son, not so much. He struggled a bit because we said, you need to go to Israel and see what's going on. He says, no, he was on a track team, and he said, oh, I'm going to miss track. He went to Israel. He came back from Israel and he said, can I go back? And he ended up spending a year before he went to college living on a kibbutz. So that's a connection that I really felt about.
That's great. And since your father was already in your life again by the time your children were growing up, they must have known him well, and they must have been aware that to an extent.
Oh, absolutely. And I can tell you so many stories about not only my children, but their children, how they loved their grandpa, and they made such a fuss about it. And you know, we'd spend all the holidays together. He never had that chance, but now we had the whole extended family. So on Pesach, we'd get together. It was wonderful. The high holidays, we'd get together. It was wonderful, especially because he moved when he retired to be near us in America, in Los Angeles.
Did you what was your relationship like with your English family throughout the rest
It was, I want to say strange is not the right word. Loving family. I mean, there was no question there was a lot of love there. The difficulty was that my foster brother was my age. So I sensed, and I think I'm right over the years looking back, that there's jealousy there because I was taking some things back because he would be able to achieve a lot more, but because I came around, he had to share. And there was some difficulty there between he and his father, et cetera. And I felt pretty bad about that. My foster sister and my sister got along pretty well. But of course, she got married. And then, interesting part, my own sister married a relative of theirs. So that was a close relationship.
And what happened to your sister? Did she live in California as well?
No. My sister stayed in Millville, New Jersey, and she, as of today, she is still there at the young age of 92 and doing very, very well. She's a widow, but her children are living fairly close. Her daughter lives in Philadelphia, which is only about an hour away, and her son lives about 15, 20 minutes away. And she's still, I talk to her all the time and wonder why she's still living alone, but she always likes to bake and things. She's still doing the same thing she did when she was younger. And thank God she's still alive. And so we talk quite a bit.
Since you mentioned that your father came to California with you, was he close with your sister? Did he see her a lot? And
No, he was more close with me. My sister had her family because he moved from New Jersey to New York, and then from New York to California. One story I should tell you, which came to my mind just now, is people ask me all the time, what do I feel about Germans, etc. And I have a strong reaction to that. I don't forgive that easily. And in 1980, I forget the exact year in the 80s, the town of Fulda decided that they were going to invite all the survivors, the Jewish survivors, back to Fulda. I don't want to say to celebrate, but to sort of maybe say they're sorry. And they took the Jewish school that I went to and turned it into a synagogue. And they paid for us to travel all over Fulda of Jews all over the world. 130 of us went back. I tell the story all the time because people say, is Germany the same? We sat in front of the so-called synagogue now, and they were putting the mezuzah, and the rabbi from Berlin came to put the mezuzah on the door. And we're all sitting there. That night at a meal, one of our friends said he was sitting on the side and a blind man and his wife walked by. And he said to her, what's going on? And she said, the Jews are back. And he said, I thought we got rid of all of them. Now, 1980s, I have to tell that story, and I will continue to tell this story, that nothing really changes that much.
Well, thank you for sharing, but I'm sure you can agree that one of the reasons why you speak is to educate everyone around the world now about dangers of bigotry, and thanks to Zoom, we can reach a wide audience today with your talk.
And I'll tell you, when we were there, they arranged that my wife and I visited with a school teacher and a husband and their 2 children. These teenagers knew absolutely nothing what was going on. Their grandparents and parents didn't tell them one thing. This is the first time, A, they met a Jew. B, they didn't know how many people were sent to concentration camps. No idea. When I told the story, they cried. They literally cried. And I said to myself, good. Now maybe we can start getting the story out, what really happened there. Recently, the synagogue, which was burnt down, was turned into a parking lot. They decided they're going to put a memorial down. The memorial has a wall, a long wall, and it has every single name of the families that were transported to concentration camps printed on it. I just received that this week. So there are people trying to still keep that up and saying, we did something wrong and we should not let it happen again.
Thank you for sharing that. Speaking of Germany, we have a question here. Did your German ever come back when you were with your father?
Interesting. I had not spoken a word of German. We were walking hand in hand and we were trying to express ourselves. And all of a sudden, I literally could understand most of what he was saying, or at least most of his saying. I could get the feeling. I could not speak too much. I couldn't say too many words in German, but I really could understand. You know, it's in the memory. And yes, some of it came back. I don't like to speak German, but it was good. We were able to communicate. I mean, just think of it. We haven't seen each other for 17 years. I don't speak a word. So he looks at me and he sees my forehead, I had a little scar on my forehead, and he recognized that because that's where I had an accident when I was a kid. But that was the only reaction, and you know, speaking through an interpreter was sort of interesting. But when we were alone, I was able to even communicate then.
So going back a little bit, and I know you were young, but what was your family's experience like leading up to the decision to send you and your sister on the Kindred Transport? Do you remember, do you remember, for example, Kristallnacht firsthand? And do you remember other instances? And do you know, we'll start with those.
Well, yes. I mean, I'm only 6 years old, but as I said, when Kristallnacht came, I was at my grandmother's, and my grandmother's apartment was overlooking the synagogue. And I watched the synagogue burning, and I watched people taking out the Torahs, trying to save the Torahs from the synagogue. The other thing I remember is I started school. I was 6 years old, and I started it was Jewish school. The headmaster used to have to come with a whip to keep the Hitler Youth out so that we could come and go. We couldn't get into there because they would go around us, but he would whip them away, and when we left also. So I remember that vividly. I remember when Hitler came to our town. Of course, I was told, don't even look, but I was a kid. And, you know, kids look at parades and everything else. That was an experience, but not much more.
I know that, understandably so, a lot of parents were hesitant to give up their children into the unknown, not even being certain that that was the right solution at the time. Do you know anything about what made your parents decide to do that? And did you ever talk to your father about this later in life when you were an adult?
I talked to my father because, like he said, it was a terrible, terrible decision. But they knew my uncle was able to get out. My aunt in New York had papers ready for us to get out. We didn't make it. They knew something was going on. And their thought was, if they can't get out, at least send the children out. Maybe we'll be lucky to go to England after them. He told me he could not go to the train station. It was tough. My mother was. I mean, can you imagine putting your children on a train and then not seeing them again forever? So it was a case of true love that said, I want my children to survive. Let's give them an opportunity to survive. If it works out, fine, but at least we've done our duty as parents to make sure our children. I wish there were more opportunities at that time before millions of these children were killed in concentration camps along with their parents. So it took a lot of courage and a lot of love. And boy, did I appreciate that, of course. And my father always said it was tough, very, very, he said it was extremely hard on them.
And now moving forward a little more, when so how exactly did you find out that your father survived? You mentioned that your sister had gotten a
All
call.
right, I'll tell you the story.
How was
I'll
that?
tell you, let me tell you the story, right? My father crossed over the border into Germany, and he moved in with a family in Fulda that they knew beforehand. And he sent a message to my aunt and uncle in Columbus, Ohio. And the message said, "I'm back. Where is Seppel and where is Ilsa?" And they'd said they're alive. So they called my sister. And my sister is the one that called my roommate and told him, as soon as Joe gets back, he's got to call me. Our father came back. That's how it happened.
Thank you for sharing that. And your foster family, do you know how they agree, or how they were connected with the Kindred Transport and how they agreed to sponsor you?
No, I really don't know. In the back of my mind, I think it was Rabbi Tarsis or somebody like that contacted them. The Jewish community in London, a lot of them were volunteering or trying to help. And when the Parliament passed the bill for 10,000, they immediately volunteered, even though they had 3 children of their own. There's a lot of stories about the Kindred Transport, and you can see this on videos. We were fortunate. There were other families that looked at this as an opportunity to get one of the children to come over and then use the children as a maid or help like that, but not truly a family. My family, my English family truly made me and made my sister and I as part of the family. No question about it. True love.
And so just to clarify, one of our audience members I would like to know, this was a Jewish family, right? And they had sponsored.
Oh, yes. And I'll tell a little story about that. You have to remember, as I told you before, we came from a very Orthodox family. At age 6 even, I had my prayer book and I davened every morning and at night. They were non-observant at all. I sort of brought some of that religion into the family, but we shouldn't look at that all the time. People ask about religion and everything else. If you're a Jew and you're a good Jew, that should suffice. Religion is something else. They weren't religious, but in a way they were more religious than most because of what they've done and what they did for us.
Thank you. I believe your wife is sitting next to you. If she's comfortable with it, we would love to meet her. Would you like to introduce her?
Sure. This is my wife, Margie. We're still on our honeymoon. We've been married 64 years, but
Well, thank you. It's so nice to meet you. And how did you meet? Were you born in the United States?
Yes. 2nd generation.
you want to tell how we met?
Yes.
I'll tell the story. I'll embarrass her. When I was stationed in Boston, I was fortunate enough to work in a laboratory. I didn't have to wear uniform and everything. It was more professional than anything else. So I lived up on Beacon Hill, if anybody remembers Boston. And we had a bunch of young professionals to get together. and we would meet in this cafe, in this small cafe. And one night we were eating there, and her good friend said, "Joe, I've got a nice Jewish girl I'd like you to meet." And I said, "Can you wait? I'm listening to the hockey game. When the hockey game is over, I'll be more than happy to meet her." And it was over. We said hello. We talked. I took her to one of the bars around the corner, and we just hit it off. And she went home. Well, I really liked her, so what I did, I saw that when she was carded, because at that time you get carded if you were too young to drink, and I noticed her birthday was the next day, so I hired a young man to take some flowers to her on the train to Revere, Massachusetts, and deliver them to her. And she'll tell you the story about that one.
Well, when I got them, there was no card. And the reason I thought it was Joe was Americans didn't send flowers to a girlfriend. It has to be Joe. And it was.
And the rest of the story is obvious.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And as you mentioned earlier, I'm so glad that your father was able to be a part of your wedding. And you said 1956?
Yes.
Thank you so much. To conclude, well, actually, two more questions. So your career, I know you worked with JNF, but what did you do as for work as well?
That would take about another 2 hours, but basically, I was very, very fortunate. I got a degree in meteorology, but that led me to a research lab in Boston called Air Force Cambridge Research Laboratory. And I actually worked for the Air Force as a civilian. And I was involved in the space program from the very, very beginning. We were using high altitude balloons before they had satellites. We built the first, I was involved with the first building of the meteorological satellite. I was then we moved to Los Angeles because I took a position there, and my job was to try to get new technology into the space program. So from all the laboratories in the Air Force program had different technologies that could be used in the space program. I then was able to go internationally, and I got involved very heavily internationally with all the heads of the space agencies around the world. And I was involved with the international labs and everything else, and formed all kinds of friends and everything and activities. So very, very active in that. Wonderful, wonderful career. Lots of good friends, and I was at the right level. I stayed in the Air Force reserves, and I ended up being a colonel in the Air Force. And my last assignment, I was involved. I was in charge of the reserve program at both launch sites at Vandenberg and the East Coast. But no, I could tell all kinds of stories about being involved in the space program. As being there at the very beginning. Think about being there at the very beginning, and then where we are today. All kinds of little stories that I could tell on that.
Thank you very much. So just two more questions. Do you remember anything about being on the train out of Germany as a child?
No, I remember I had my suitcase and I had a tag around my neck. And the only thing I remembered was we took the train to Holland, and then we took the boat. And I got violently sick because I hate water. I get sick in water. As a side, when we came over on the Queen Mary, we were in Southampton, ready to take off, and I was sick. And the steward came down and he said, "What's the matter?" I said, "I'm so sick." He said, "What's going to happen when we leave the port?" That's how bad it was. So I was sick all the way across the ocean.
Thank you very much. So as a concluding question, what do you think we can do to end hatred and contempt around the world?
What's the expression from our Torah and even in the Bible? Do unto others as you would to yourselves. But doing more, but it's not just me. We need to have more lessons learned on the result of hatred. It's not just anti-Semitism. It's anti-Muslim. It's anti-Black. It's anti-Vietnamese. It's anti. I tell the children that I talk to, I bleed the same way they bleed. The blood is the same. And we need to treat each other with respect, but more with love. If we just had more love, if we had more interaction with each other, it's amazing that you can get people, I don't say they hate each other, but it's the fact that they don't know enough about each other. For example, they don't know what they don't know who we were in Florida State University, and there were people that had never met a Jew in their lives. And, I had to tell them I didn't have horns. And within a matter of weeks, we were perfect, wonderful friends and stayed friends. So more communication, more lessons learned. And one thing that I think really needs to be done is we really have to have that part of the total education system in the United States. They have to learn. I know it's hard to say that in California you have to teach the Holocaust, but when I talk about the Holocaust, I try not to just harp on that. I say the importance is it's everything. It's learning to live with each other. We're all the same. We should live because it's more important to love each other than hate each other.
Well, thank you so much again for sharing your story with us today. And your story is so important because it highlights the Kindred Transport, which was, as we said, such an act of kindness in such a horrific time. And thanks to that kindness and the kindness of, your foster family, you're able to share your story today and to teach the message that you just mentioned, as well as telling students to go home and hug their parents, which I know you do when you speak to students. And we appreciate that so much. And the Kindred Transport is a very important part of the history of the Holocaust. In fact, our museum board chair, Michelle Gold, is a second generation Kindred Transport survivor. Her mother was on the Kindred Transport. She co-wrote a book with Gabriella Karen, Memories That Won't Fade Away. Gabriella is a survivor, and Joe, you are actually in that book.
Right.
And so we thank you so much for highlighting this story and for teaching us this morning everything that you have taught us. We're so grateful to have you and your wife in our community, and it was nice to meet you. And this is really such a special opportunity for everybody watching. So
I don't need to be thanked. I take this as an obligation, if you will, and take it seriously. Not looking for any titles or anything else. If through my message I get through to one person, and one person says, you know what, maybe I'll change. Maybe I'll look at something different. That is going to be my reward.
Thank you. And you did actually do that. You spoke with, we received a lot of comments from people in the audience just saying thank you very much. So we really appreciate it, and we're glad to have you here sharing your story. We wish you a good rest of the week and happy, healthy, and safe weekend to you and everybody tuning in. We have survivors.
I was going to say that everybody stay safe. This is the main thing nowadays.
Definitely, we agree. We have regular virtual programs, so please follow our website to everyone watching. And we have survivors speak every Thursday at 11 o'clock. Next Thursday, we have Erica Schwartz, a survivor from Hungary, who will be speaking. So again, thank you everyone for participation, and please follow us, and we'll provide the programs we thank you.
Thank you.